Okay, we're into the final section of motivation, Psych 122. We're going to talk a little bit about incentives, a little bit about motivations in terms of drives, get into a little theory in this lecture, but later we're going to get into some issues related to behavioral economics. I know, that sounds fun. Okay, so let's get going. Well, we've talked about these a little bit, but we're going to get into the ideas of drives, needs, and awareness. A drive is this internal push, an urge that forces you to, or an organism to do stuff. A lot of this work is done with animals. Now, these can be external motivations, such as incentives or goals or even monies, or internal motivations. So we'll get into the difference between those two. So an internal motivation, we get back into that notion of homeostasis. The animal gets out of homeostasis, that creates a need, and there's a drive to fulfill that need. So those can be physiological and they can be psychological. We as animals, as human beings, have curiosity needs, have mental stimulation needs. We don't do well when we get bored or isolated. And of course there's physiological needs like thirst and oxygen and water. The drives can be produced by a deprivation of either a psychological or physiological need. And we get back to Clark Hall. Clark Hall said that deviation from homeostasis, both psychological and physiological, can produce these psychological needs, and there's a drive to get back to homeostasis. I'm going to give you a few examples. Well, for example, if you put somebody in sensory deprivation, now they have plenty of food and water and all those kinds of needs, but you reduce just simple stimulation, it's kind of a weird thing happens. People begin to hallucinate. People begin to lose track of time. It's like the brain is trying to stimulate. Without external stimulation, the brain is creating its own stimulation, and it can be kind of a weird thing for people. So now we get into Hull's drive theory. Psychological drives are created when an animal, including human, is deprived of what it needs. So this energizes behavior. As a simple example, if you put a rat in a little box and he was well fed and had a lot to drink, he wouldn't move around much. But as soon as you reduce the amount of food that it was getting, it would begin walking around. It would begin trying to investigate its environment, seeking food. It's creating that drive to get that animal up and going. The more intense the drive, the more intense the behavior. So drive can translate into performance. So a couple of examples. One of them comes from the idea of the difference between the learning and performance experiment, the learning and performance distinction. Sometimes animals can learn something, but if there's no drive, you don't see behavior. You don't see action. Here's an experiment. Group 1, take a group of rats. Deprive rats and have them run through a maze to get food. They're hungry, they're deprived, they're hungry, they run through, they get food. A second group also kind of meanders through a maze, but he's well fed. When he gets to the end, there's food there, but he's not hungry. He's not hungry. And then you make both of the animals hungry. You deprive them of food and you test them. And these are what you see. You see up here, this animal is well fed, and so the amount of time it takes to get through the maze is very slow. This animal is deprived, and he gets through the maze very quickly and learns very quickly. The question is, did this top group, the group that was well fed, did it learn about the maze? Well, as soon as you make the animal hungry, as soon as you decrease the amount of food the animal has, increase the need, increase the drive, the animal, instead of going through this sort of slow learning, really shows rapid learning, shows that it had learned all along. It just needed the drive to move. Here's another experiment by Hillman. Rats were trained to run through a maze to get water. And you just look at the different levels of deprivation. So in this group, it's called the 2 to 2 group, it was only deprived for 2 hours and tested after 2 hours. Not very deprived. The animal's not very thirsty. There's not a lot of drive. This animal was deprived 22 hours. That is very thirsty animal. Run through the maze very thirsty and tested very thirsty. This group, we got a nice balance here. It was not trained while very thirsty. It was only deprived for 2 hours, but tested very thirsty. It's kind of another latent learning experiment. And this group was trained, deprived, and tested after only 2 hours of drinking. It had water only 2 hours ago, so it wasn't very deprived. And these are the kind of results that we see in this case. The 2 to 2, not a lot of performance, continues not a lot of performance. This is the point of switching. Group in yellow, very deprived and still highly motivated. This group, not very deprived, but test deprived, and you can see that that drive, that thirst, speeds the animal up. And this one, of course, deprived here, right here in green, deprived, while training, runs very fast, but as soon as it's not motivated, it doesn't have the drive because it's not that thirsty. You see the performance not all that great. So animals learn, but they need that drive. It's the same a little bit with humans. Let's look at another couple of experiments. It's not only a physiological need. Sometimes it can just be other kinds of needs. So one animal, in this case, was trained to do certain behaviors to get an artificial sweetener, a saccharin sweetener. And what they found was the animals were still highly motivated to do this. This does not reduce an energy need. Artificial sweetener does not in any way produce energy in our body. It goes right through our bodies. Not like glucose or fructose. This just tastes good, and the animals are still motivated to do it. A monkey, for example, will learn just to press levers just to be able to look out a window, just to stimulate its brain a little bit. Now, this doesn't necessarily reduce a drive, a primary drive in terms of food or oxygen or salt, but maybe it reduces a drive in relationship to other needs that the animal has, needs of psychological needs, not just physiological needs. So sometimes, so example, here's the animal, he's pressing the lever and he's getting saccharin. He'll learn to press the lever. We talk about these theories as being hedonic, being just pleasurable, not physiological, not reducing a primary need or primary drive, but just pleasurable. You like my little tongue there? That's animation. So we get into these other issues, especially when related to child and development and children education. We have these curiosity drives. We as animals, especially primates, when an animal is exposed to novel stimuli, this arouses their interest. We have curiosity drives, we have boredom drives. We do not like being bored. Animals don't like being bored. Children don't like being bored. It creates this motivation, this drive to do things. And so, one of the worst things you can do to a person is put them in isolation. Like in prison, in isolation, they get bored and the brain is just not set up to do that. Lack of stimulation can retard or slow development. Let me give you some examples. This is a very famous experiment by Rosenwig, 1984. He did this with rats. So picture this. We have 3 groups of rats. One group was housed by themselves, visually and acoustically isolated from other rats. In other words, they had all the food they can eat, but no stimulation, no interaction. And these are social animals. Group 2, well, they got to be housed with another rat. Okay, they got fed, they got water, and they got a little playmate. And then group 3 is housed in a visually stimulating environment for rats. This is the happy rat environment. It's got wheels. It's got all sorts of things. So, here's it in isolation, deprived. Here the animal is housed together, but not a lot of toys and things. And here's a little colony of happy rats. And then the animals were given a number of tests. Okay, so group 1, group 2, Group 3, happy, happy rats. Look at how much fun they're having. They even have a little teddy bear here. How cool is that? And what we see when we take the brains out of these rats, what we do, and we look at neurons, and we look at neuron development, and we look at dendritic branching, we see it much reduced in the deprived animal, in group 1. The brain has a lower weight, we have less dendritic branching, less axonal branching. The brain doesn't develop. You know, a lot of people talk about this study when they look at research with rats. They say, well, was this rat isolated during your research? Because that really affects a lot of things. It affects their behavior, but it affects their brain too. So maybe there's this idea that we have this curiosity drive and this to combat boredom drive because our brain doesn't develop, doesn't work well when it doesn't have stimulation. Now, another example of this are cases of orphanages. Not a nice orphanage where there's lots of caring people and lots of games to play, but maybe you look at places that are maybe in war-torn areas. There's a very famous study in Romania, the Romanian orphanage study. Here are a bunch of children, this was done a long time ago, who, because of their war that had been going on in the area, there was a lot of lost parents and isolated kids, and these kids were all fed. These kids were all changed. These kids were warm. They just weren't handled. They just weren't touched. They just weren't played with. They just didn't have toys. And when these children developed, by the age of 5 and 6, they had severe mental disabilities, severe learning disabilities. They had a lot of problems emotionally, especially emotionally bonding with other people. And there's all these methods that can be used to try to get the kids, back on track. But without stimulation, without interaction, the brain doesn't develop. That said, you don't need to take children and read them Shakespeare and play Mozart all the time. In fact, there was this company that had this baby Einstein, and you'd put your baby in front of the TV and all these shapes would come on and, ooh, look at this great development. Turned out not to be true. There was no difference. If a child is simply loved and cared for and played with, that's fine. Doing all the extra stuff doesn't seem to bring them to another level. But in an orphanage, that if they're getting nothing, then we can have really severe disabilities. So now we get into one of the most famous parts of motivation theory, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What Maslow was saying is that needs have levels. There's basic needs and there are higher needs, and you must fulfill and satisfy one level before moving to another. So here are some of the stages. There's a physiological, water, air, food. Listen, you're not going to get up into other needs if you're not eating and not drinking, if you're starving to death. If it's all about survival, that's all you're focused on. Then we get into safety. Once you have food and water and drink, then you get into safety. Are you secure? Is there no crime? Is there peace? Those are the needs that occupy your time. Once you have physiological needs and safety needs satisfied, you can move on to things like love and affection, a sense of belonging. Listen, if you're not safe or if you're not fed, then these kinds of things may have a difficult time developing. Then the fourth level is esteem needs. Esteem stems from our position in the relationship to the outer world, achievement, confidence, all those things. Those come about once we have physiological safety, belonging. These are met. And finally, that famous self-actualization. Okay, this is where you can devote yourself to causes and vocations and sports and music because all your other needs are satisfied. And Maslow said you must pass one level before going on to the other. Physiological, safety, belonging, self-esteem, self-actualization, those levels go up. Well, it's kind of true and kind of not. It doesn't always have to be in that order. But it is there is some characteristics that go with this. So one way of assessing your level and how well you're achieving those different levels is to give people questionnaires. And this one's called the Need Satisfaction Inventory. It was done by Lester in 1990, and you give scores to things. Give a -3 if you strongly disagree. You give a +3 if you strongly agree, to a whole bunch of statements. Let's look at a few of those statements. I have adequate amount of rest. Do you 3 strongly agree? 2, 1, -3, you can't sleep at all? I get an adequate amount of exercise. Physical needs, right? These are just your basic physical needs. Think the world is a pretty safe place. I can depend on others, okay? See how these are measuring safety needs. I have few intimate friends on whom I can rely. I know my family will be on my side no matter what. These are measures of belonging. And usually this inventory is a very long list of questions. I took this inventory and I just sampled out a few to show you how we might investigate where somebody is on Maslow's hierarchical needs. I feel respected by my peers. I stand on my own 2 feet. How would you score that? Okay. Finally, we get into that self-actualization. My life has meaning. I feel that I'm growing as a person. How well do you score on that? And it's a way of looking at and investigating and quantifying in some ways Maslow's needs. So, for example, some research on these needs is one, we find that military students, there was comparing military students and college students, and military students who are in basic training, they are exercising all day long. They're not getting a lot of time to eat. They're certainly not getting a long time to sleep. And they gravitate on these types of scales towards the lower end. So one might also suspect that as lower needs become satisfied, they would become less important. And that's not always completely true. Let's take, for example, some people who have gone on hunger strikes. These people, you might say, are really becoming self-actualized and important, like Gandhi and Cesar Chavez. They went on hunger strikes. They were at the very lowest. They were not getting enough food, and yet they were doing it to have this higher purpose, to have this important purpose. So it's not satisfying level 1 while satisfying a self-actualization. So it doesn't always have to go in complete order. So another thing we can look at is we can measure levels of achievement, how well people are focusing on achieving certain goals, how driven are they. One way of doing that, and it's nothing I've ever been involved with, it sounds kind of interesting, is having people tell stories or respond to either images that really don't have a specific meaning, or a test called the thematic apperception test. And I'm going to give you demonstrations of both of those. The inkblot test is actually, they'll show an image like this, Rorschach's test. I'm sure you've heard of it. And there's this whole scoring system. When people look at this and respond and say what they see, what are they saying about the dark areas? What are they saying about the negative areas, the white areas, back and forth, whole way of testing to look at their achievement. So what do you see in this? I'll give you a second. Really? That's what you see? Well, that's a little disturbing. Okay, I'll move on. What about that one? Oh, come on. Really? That's what you see? Okay, you need to see a psychologist, I think, or take a psychology course or something. I don't know what I see. What do I see? Maybe a spider-like thing. Of course, Rorschach's test has been joked about for years by psychologists and non-psychologists. The planet of inkblot. Hideous monster. No, I see an exotic flower. I always like the far side there. It's just a simple Rorschach inkblot test. What do you see? Yeah, okay. Well, the thematic apperception test is a little bit more involved. It's kind of like an inkblot test. It's where we get people to respond by using how they interpret what they see. So you show a series of cards to a subject. Cards have pictures that are ambiguous, but have potential levels of achievement by the individual. There are people in the story. And usually when people respond, they identify with the protagonist or the main character of the image. And they will talk about that person, and you will get insight into how they are feeling. So what's this person thinking about? What are they doing? What has happened in their life, and what are they thinking about doing? And the person responds, and they tell the story, and they really put themselves in that place. How about this one? That's a little weird. But this one actually came from the thematic apperception test. I thought I'd just at least put it in. It's a little disturbing. And then you score. Stories are scored for achievement motivation based reference to competition with a standard of excellence. How much do they hold themselves up to a high standard? Or a unique accomplishment, or long-term involvement. These are all these tests, all these ways of scoring how these people respond. But the TAT, the thematic apperception test, can be used to measure the intensity of aroused and motivated achievement. So I wanted to show you the TAT to then talk about some other experiments. So here's an experiment, very famous experiment done with the TAT. So you have 4 experimental groups designed to produce different intensities in the need to achieve. Conditions involve various tests or problems that the people had to solve, such as an anagram. An anagram is rearranged words. So dormitory could be rearranged into the word dirty room. Listen could be turned into silent. That's an anagram. Switching the letters around and getting new words. So they're given these tests. And they were put in different conditions. You have a relaxed condition where there is like, hey, do your best, it's all good, see how many anagrams you can make. A neutral conditions, students were just asked to work hard. The failure condition, I love this one. This is really intense. Students, you score the students, you go, oh, okay. Yeah, you know, a lot of people did much better than you did. An artificially high norm. I'm a little surprised that you couldn't get more anagrams. Your fellow students scored considerably higher than you did. You know, this is that condition. Psychologists can be mean. And a success-failure condition. Students were first. They were told that they'd do very well. They were given another test, and then they were told, oh, nope, not doing very well. And following this experiment, following those different groups, all students wrote stories to 4 of the thematic apperception test pictures. You know, they showed them a picture, they identify them, they write about these stories. And the results were the more intense the aroused achievement motive of the student. In other words, if they were relaxed in a condition, do your best, it's all good, condition 1, well, that's how they talked about this individual. If they were put in that really harsh condition, then they would write about that protagonist in the picture as failing or not achieving and all those kinds of things. So you took on, as soon as you had an experience of success, that's how you wrote. If you had an experience of failure, that's how you wrote. Shows that the TAT is sensitive to need intensity and is a good measure of achievement. So it was basically, this is a prime experiment, a primed experiment. The students were primed in certain conditions. So these are the need to achieve scores. Remember, there's a lot of ways to quantify the TAT scoring in terms of certain words that they use, how much they talk about achieving, how much they talk about success or trying new things, all these ways. And so in the neutral group, you know, I need to achieve. The failure is how I have to really overcome. And this is the most. If you start off with success, then turn to failure, you get these really high scores on the thematic apperception test. Okay, well, that's the end of lecture 1. We're almost there.